Welcome back to another podcast of today, the backstory. And this is Chris, and I am Tim, and we're old friends, and we both are retired high school history teachers.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's funny. My sister was watching one of our podcasts, Chris,
Yeah.
and and she said, "You guys look too young to be retired."
Yeah.
And she knows how I qualified for early retirement, so she was just teasing us.
Yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, the idea of today, the backstory, is to use history to better understand today's issues.
Yeah.
And so, what's on the docket for today?
Okay. So on the docket for today, we're going to look at the No Kings movement, the No Kings protest, and
Yep.
then we're going to do a dive into the history of nonviolent civil resistance. Okay, and a couple
Yep.
couple things that I'd like the listeners to consider. And I, of course, you and I do a lot of research on this, and we have to study up and the rest of it. So it's
Right.
also questions for ourselves to consider.
Yep.
But they are: what is a protest? When does a protest become a movement?
Yep.
And what are the ingredients for change? And sometimes people look at history as, so they'll say, well, history repeats, it's all cyclical. However, there really is no one historical era exactly lines up
Right.
with another. Although I think that we can say that there are patterns that are revealed, like similar patterns are revealed through history. So
Yep.
I think I think the big thing is that thinking about what's going on in society when a protest movement comes together, and then when is it literally, it's no longer a protest, it becomes a movement. And
Hmm.
then when is it possible for change to occur, right? Because sometimes people say, well, why protest is not going to change anything. So I mean, I don't believe that personally.
Right.
I think it
Right.
changes a lot.
Right. And for me, I go through cycles, right? Sometimes I'm um, more cynical than others, right?
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is maybe today is a time to park the cynicism in a
Right.
lot of ways, and we do live in quite a cynical society. Okay, so Tim, you have a great story. I'd like to hear your story about something
Right.
about you being a child, a 5-year-old at a Vietnam War protest. Tim, take it away.
Right, yeah. So my father was a major in the Army, and he served in Vietnam in 68 and 69. And he was pretty supportive of the war before he got there, and changed his mind, came home, met with the congressman, and said, we need to leave Vietnam. And he he was one of the veterans that protested the war, which really gave the movement credibility. And so he took me to the state capitol here in Minnesota when I was 5 years old, and I
Right.
was just amazed at this big event. And I came home, and my mom said, "So how was it?" And I said, "I learned a new song. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. Nixon stopped the effing war." And
Oh,
she said, "Okay, no more Vietnam protests for Timmy."
yeah,
And yeah, it's a funny anecdote, but really from the my first memories, right? There was My parents said that there was a problem that needed fixing,
yeah,
and it's not to say that that everything was wrong, but
yeah,
there was serious issues out there that we can be involved in, and
yeah.
without saying that, that was the message.
And this is kind of, it's such a great message because it speaks to it kind of goes against the whole idea of cynicism,
Right.
right? The idea that you can make a change, but let's kind of expand that a little bit to say the idea that we have a right to assert that we feel that a change is needed, right? We have a right to protest, freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. There are many of these freedoms we talk about, and they come with responsibilities. It's not just like what I get to do,
Right.
all of that. So you were just at No Kings in
Yeah.
Minneapolis, which is at the heartbeat, the absolute heartbeat of the No Kings movement. The entire world is watching and participating in the No Kings movement. And I'm going to do a little piece here on No Kings, just the facts.
Okay.
And then I'm going to run right into, because I want to find out a little bit about your experience of this one in Minneapolis. So No Kings, for listeners out there are kind of heard about it, but not entirely sure of when it started. And it started in 2025. In response to a whole bunch of different things. Some people say authoritarianism, the erosion of democratic norms, the possibility, or the real possibility, and the perception of abuses of the Constitution. And I think a big part of it was retaking the idea that the purpose of government is to serve the people, consent of the governed.
Yep.
And, people feeling like they were losing that, or that was already, some people would feel already lost to some degree, right? Mm-hmm. So there were a couple interesting triggers that I hadn't really pieced together. So I'd heard about this military parade in the United States, and I'd heard about the cost of it, like in our Canadian media. There was going to be a parade in Washington, D.C. on June 14th, which also lined up with the president's 79th birthday, and it was the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary, major military parade. Mm-hmm. But I hadn't kind of lined that up with No Kings, and I guess it's seen as some kind of a coronation event, right?
Right. Well, yeah. So that was our response.
Yeah. So that was kind of what it was. So that was definitely one of the triggers for the first No Kings, right? There's also, many other triggers, the response to the immigration enforcement and the killing of innocent people in the United States. No due process within that whole system too. These federal agents. I think that the Rene Good, the government just came down and said that the Rene Good killing was justified. That came down just a few days ago by the U.S. government. So then that goes right into this whole business of due process, or the lack of due process, in a big way. I think one big beautiful bill was another trigger. Of course, the Iran war, which is going on right now, and a
lot of other things.
Federal government. I mean, we're back in a whack-a-mole, Tim. I'm sorry. Federal government shutdowns. I could keep going. I'll stop. Three protests. June 2025, 5 million people out. October 2025, 7 million. March 2026. 3,100 events in all 50 states, 9 million participants.
Wow.
International, Toronto, Halifax, Ottawa, that's just up here. Yep. Paris, France, Rome, Italy, Portugal, Germany, Australia, Japan, Costa Rica, all events taking place.
Just the thought of a Japanese protest is kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, especially. Well, there are all kinds of protests.
It's culturally, it's a democracy, but
but protest happens a little bit differently in the way that we think of it. Also, you think about those numbers. It comes to mind for me is the 3.5% rule, about when people feel like something is wrong and 3.5% of your society agree that something is wrong, they can rise up and change, generally speaking, begins. So that's an interesting piece too. The numbers have been growing, but I don't think No Kings is necessarily about the numbers. No Kings is known to be peaceful. It's also known to be creative, and lots of frog costumes, and lots of all kinds of floats and parades, and things like this, and caricatures. And again, I'm going to go back to peaceful, committed to non-violent action. So that's kind of the snapshot of No Kings, and there've been 3 so far. I'm sure there'll be more. What was your experience, Tim, being there in the heartbeat of it all in Minneapolis?
Right. So as many people know, this was the big one, and the history is that in January and February, the president sent 3,000 ICE officials here, and they were not using due process, and it was a severe strain on our community, and it was great to see how the rest of the nation supported. Not everyone, but there was so much support throughout the nation for the protesters on the spot in the area where the agents were taking people, and um, and it was great in general how it was nonviolent, right? And in my mind, the comparison is January 6th, where there was a lot of
Wow.
violence. Just the image of
Oh,
protesters using bear spray,
right.
just totally what Can you imagine the blowback if that was the case here? Anyway, um, so I went on Saturday and helped out with a huge huge replica of the Constitution, which
Yes.
means a lot
Yes.
to me.
Yeah.
Um, and that just starting with "We the People" really reinforces our ideas of consent to the people. And um, it was really important just to see other people and smile and say all right and
Yeah.
kind of smile at other people's creative signs
Yeah.
and we get together like this a lot and I'm able to talk to a lot of people, or we're able to talk to a lot of people using technology, but it's important to be face to face too. And the sun was out, and there was a little bit, I gave myself 2 seconds to celebrate, making it through the winter and making it kind of through that really difficult period. But the
A really
sword of
tough.
Damocles is still over us, because we don't know what ICE will look like after the negotiations and everything, and whether they come back here or anywhere else. Any people that are under the jackboot of federal government, we hurts us, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we want to end it. So there's one other point, because I could go on and on, but
No, no. This is this
this
is
is
this is
the
important.
yeah. Um, Part of the reason why I started up my Substack, using history to understand today's events and to um, protect classical liberalism from the MAGA new right, and I really feel strongly that it's important. We're really getting down to crunch time where people from all sides, all parts of the political spectrum, work together to prevent MAGA from continuing, or slow them down and then stop them. And so the great thing about No Kings was, um, Trump was the reason why we're all together. So there were Bernie fans, and there were moderates, all kinds
Okay.
of different people,
Right.
for one cause.
So it's
And
got
that's why I
one.
started the Substack, was to show people that we're united behind the idea of freedom and democracy and rights.
Yeah, like one
And
big tent, right? Like one big
yes,
tent.
yes, and I know that you're a historian of the 20s and 30s in Europe, and sometimes the fascists were able to come to power because of a division on the left, right? And so I was, we would study it, we would teach it, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, we need to make sure that we're united, and that was a physical evidence of how people are on the same page.
And what I love about what you just said is that sometimes people frame unity as that, well, no, we all have to think the same way and we all have to
No,
believe exactly the same things.
right,
Unity is found in diversity. Period.
right,
And I've done lots of different things in my life. One of them is hiring. I always hired with that in mind. I hired people from all kinds of different walks of life and different
points of
cultural
view.
backgrounds, and because I knew that diversity would ultimately be our strength,
Yep.
and that. So, throughout all of this, a lot of us, the dark winter, we can call it, without,
Right.
it's not melodramatic in any sense of the word. A lot of us here have had a real, pit in the bottom of our stomachs.
Right.
That aching feeling that you
Yeah.
get.
That's what
It
I
was
was talking about, right? And
Oh, I was so happy to see you sent me that photo of the Constitution.
yeah,
Send me that photo of the Constitution, and thank goodness you guys are able to kind of keep it in place with the wind and everything like
yeah,
that as you kind of you're part of moving it through the streets. But
yep,
the reason I bring it up, it brought me hope, and I
yep,
think that Minneapolis people, I want the people in Minneapolis and folks throughout the United States to know that No Kings and protests like that bring hope to the rest of the
yes,
world,
yes,
right? To people that are living under repressive regimes but are still able to get news,
yep,
to people living in democracies where authoritarians have seized power and they're really a democracy in name only, or in part only.
yep.
This is something that's not only in the United States, but people are watching very closely, and people are mobilizing all over the world,
And
with the same.
I'd like to add to that. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Um, the, and I'd like to say to anyone out there, just speaking for myself, but observing. I know it's hard to see a great nation that believes in democracy take steps backwards, but know that there is perhaps a majority of us or more that are here fighting and caring um, for the rights of the people, and it's hard when we see what this administration does, but know that it's not over and that we're going to win.
Well, and I think another hugely important thing it does, that one of the ways it brings hope, is that administrations know that they have the loudest megaphone. So then
Right,
they make some snappy little comment, or they try to characterize a whole
right,
group of diverse people that have come together, for example, in No Kings, as agitators or paid protesters, or they come up with some slogan or something like this. But No Kings is a much louder megaphone,
yep,
because it not only you're marching in unity, but you're starting to create connections with people that are there. And I think it plants the seeds of a movement, and maybe in a lot of ways too, the kind of regrowth of, excuse my cheesy metaphor there, but
right,
the regrowth of a relook at democratic values, right? and
yep,
and why we believe in them, and why we know that they're so important for us. I think, and again, I think it's been, because we've been so comfortable in North America, it's just super easy for us to take it for granted.
right. Well,
Something,
I did, yeah,
and me too. Yep,
yeah,
it's something could slip away very, very easily. Okay, hope. I think
hope,
Tim, it was
yeah,
super. For me, it was just like to feel. I felt that hope coming from Minneapolis, and it kind of lifted us here north of the border as well. We're gonna go down the history path now. We're gonna take a look at I'm going to start though, right before history, with the word protest. A lot
right,
of people think they peg it to religion right away, but actually, its Latin root means to kind of come forth, to assert something you believe really strongly in, to specifically to bear witness, to testify to something that you have a lot of faith in. We could talk
right,
about democratic values, right? And then later on, this word protest became sort of pegged, more closely to the Reformation, and a split in the Christian church into the Protestant movement, and the Catholic movement, and that. So it became later to be known as something sort of like something you would come out, speak against, or you felt was contradictory and you would go against. But I think that in understanding the word protest, and why we protest and the need for protest, I think it's important for us to realize it's actually both. You're not just out there being against something. You're there to testify, to bear witness for the things that you believe in,
right,
right? It's not just that I'm opposed and I'm against, right? So I think both are important. All right,
yep.
let's go down the path of history. Martin Luther. Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, a German priest and a friar who sparked the Protestant Reformation. And, just that word Reformation might throw you a little bit, but we're talking about, this was an earthquake that went off in society, because you had, in the Christian world anyway, you had folks really under one church, a very hierarchical church, and
Yep.
control of a whole lot, let's
Yep.
just say. And so Martin Luther, he starts to challenge Catholic doctrines, Catholic beliefs, and ultimately the hierarchy of the church and the sale of indulgences. I don't know if you ever saw that Monty Python piece where the life of Brian, where
No.
everyone's convinced that he's the Messiah, but Brian's like, "Can you just please just leave me alone?" And I think he threw a shoe at them. He threw a shoe out his window and told the people at the window who were trying to worship him to
Yeah.
go away, please go away. And as soon as they grabbed the shoe, they're like, "The shoe, the sacred shoe!" And
Yeah.
the crowd went wild. So you think about indulgences, you think about things that were sold at the bones of Christ, or or this person touched that, or those sorts of things. So he was against those sorts of things. But more importantly, he reportedly nails his work, the 95 theses in 1517, on the All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And the reporter, we don't know if he really nailed them there, but it's
Right.
a great image. And basically within them were things like priests can marry, were things like you do not need a priest to speak directly to God, all kinds of different things. Now, these things being said were, heresy. The
Right.
Catholic Church, they excommunicated Martin Luther, and he kept going and led to what's known as Protestantism, which, was this whole other way of doing Christianity. But, it's interesting. He was moved in a nonviolent way to nail what he believed onto the door or to speak out against it. And he was speaking out against, at the time, would have been one of the most powerful forces in the world, in which Christianity was sort of ruling the roost of everything. In fact, it's fair to say the every aspect of one's life greatly controlled by the church. So incredible that somebody could affect that change, right?
Can I add a point, if you don't mind?
Go ahead.
All right. So yeah, the idea that we believe so much in is that you can understand this world by understanding how it was made, and looking back at it. And we live in a pretty individualistic society, but during the Middle Ages, that was very discouraged, and people in general did not stand up for themselves or think for themselves, and were not encouraged to do so. And Martin Luther really set the standard for, I have a conscience, right?
Yep.
I can determine what's right or wrong, and not only can I speak up for that, I should. And and these are all ideas that we inherited, and it's hard to imagine them not being there, right?
I know.
But for 1,000 years or more, right? That was individuals were not encouraged to think for themselves. And what we want to do, I know you agree, is to prevent going back to that same kind of situation.
Oh yeah. We're going. It's almost like the Margaret Atwood story there, right? That we do not want to. We don't want anything like Gilead happening. Of course, technologically during Martin Luther's era, we got this printing press thing hanging around. We got this, and ideas could spread. And of course, at that time, literacy is very low. A lot of people can't read, but the folks that can read are usually the ones that are, maybe the very powerful in the royal courts and the rest of this, but in the church. And everybody else, not so much, right? Mm-hmm. So his ideas spread, and they spread like wildfire, right? They were catchy. I love what you said about the idea that an idea that's rooted in conscience, an idea that's rooted in what we consider to be important, freedom, right? Different kinds of freedom. All right, fantastic, Tim. Now you are on the hot seat with a fellow by the name of Thoreau, and I have to say that I learned quite a bit in the last little bit about Thoreau, because I read on Walden Pond and all the rest of that business, and I know him as an amazing rant artist. But, and I agree with his whole environmental rant that he had in Walden and the rest of that, and his critique of capitalism within there. But there's a lot more to it. Take it away.
Well, that's a good start, right? So he lived in the 1800s. He was born in 1817, 1862, lived in New England. His writings were not that effectual during his lifetime, but became hugely important and read and affected people from Tolstoy to Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And and before I get into the civil disobedience part, as you mentioned, right, he believed in self-reliance and getting back to nature, and so that's individualism, right? That's part of that modern idea, and and transcendentalism,
Oh
which
yeah.
is believes in spirituality, not necessarily through religion. So once again, individualism, and starting with a tax collector trying to collect money, and it was during the Mexican American War.
Yeah.
He had the idea that he shouldn't have to pay taxes to a government that did something that he thought was immoral, and that really started the germ of the idea of determining, using your conscience to determine what's right or wrong, not being told what to think, but thinking for yourself, critical thinking,
Mm.
and then once you decide, if you see injustice, you do something about it. You either speak up, but peacefully, and sometimes even by breaking an immoral law and
Mm.
suffering the consequences to be morally just, but then also to draw attention to the immoral law so that it can be changed. So he was a naturalist.
Wow.
Um, and led to lots of important people like John Muir and others that led to the national parks and so on. And he was an anarchist, which is, back then that was the word used, but is similar to libertarian. So
Right.
so there's all kinds of ends, but the main thing is that he was an important. There were probably libertarians before him. There was probably
Yeah.
civil disobedience before him. The
Yeah.
main thing is that he wrote about it, and then many other thinkers read it and practiced it.
It's interesting, and it's an excellent segue for Thoreau to go right into the great Russian thinker and writer Leo Tolstoy as
Yep.
well. Also seen as an anarchist, and for folks who are kind of wondering what it means, and no archy government, right? And basically, essentially saying that government itself can become an evil. Government itself
Yep.
can do the individual wrong, and so we got to really be careful with this government thing, right? It's a bit of a leviathan. It's a bit of a monster if once it gets
Right.
going. So Leo Tolstoy, 19th century, he's in Russia. Really looked at nonviolent resistance to a lot of things that he disagreed with and that were going on in the Russian state at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And he really influenced Mahatma Gandhi and eventually Martin Luther King. A couple things about Tolstoy: um, nonviolent resistance. Did not
Right.
believe in violence. Another one, he believed
Yeah.
that governments can be inherently violent. Violent.
He he
They
would not have he would not have gone to the January 6th.
No, absolutely. He was not. He was not present at the January 6th
Yeah, he didn't
thing.
have bear spray.
No, no, he wasn't there. Wasn't there climbing over barriers and injuring and people died in that as well. So he believed that the state. He believed we really got to be careful with the state. The mechanisms of government could be used to harm the individual. And he felt that I think part of his thinking was that when this collective state business is really only interested in the accumulation of power and holding on to power. So therefore, they're basically going to take on actions that are unethical. That they're not going to be kind of thinking about their conscience or following a constitution. And when it rings very clear to what's going on in the Western world with authoritarian leaders throughout, where they're ignoring constitution, they're ignoring rule of law, right? And they are just saying, "Well, I'm doing this for the betterment of you," but they're really just doing it to accumulate power,
Right.
right? I think
Yep.
that I think that's another one. Another one is he was very against military action, right?
Yep.
He was super against the Russo-Japanese War and military service. So, in a way, you could say that it was part of this whole business of being a conscientious objector, right? It
Right.
might have been the birth of that idea.
Hmm.
I remember. I'm just going to segue back, but I remember during the Reagan era when we were working together
Yep.
that the letters were coming letters got to us in the place we were working, and they were something to do with a pre-draft letter or something like this way back at that time.
Okay, so I need to jump in here.
Yeah,
You're remembering correctly. The wording is registration. So
right.
it's the law, and it's still the law.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and
Okay.
Jimmy Carter started it in like 1979
Okay.
when Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union,
Right.
and they never took it away. And so earlier this year, my son Charlie got his letter in the mail from the Selective Service saying that
Wow.
it's the law and you need to sign up. So yeah, and there's we could go into that rabbit hole, right? Down that
We
rabbit
could.
hole of
Yeah.
is it just for a government to force you to do something like that? And whether there would be enough, if there was a just war, whether there would be enough volunteers,
Enough
that kind of
volunteers to
thing.
do it. So
Yeah.
that does not exist north of the border, and that's something I did not
Oh yeah, yeah.
understand. That's incredible. I know folks from Italy who have served were
Yep.
military and or social service, and in Germany were military and or social service, and in Israel, different countries around the world where military service is mandatory,
Right.
or you have
War service. Yeah.
some kind of service choice at a young age. But needless to say, Tolstoy would not have been in favor of that letter.
Right.
So signing, he would see it as a way, be something against your conscience to register, right? And again, he was also for simple living, for going back to the land. He did not believe in land ownership either. Tolstoy
Which is really interesting because
did not
he
believe
was a
in private
lawyer, right?
did not believe in private property. Now, Leo Tolstoy, of course, was corresponding with a fellow by the name of Gandhi. When Gandhi was in South Africa, and Gandhi, there was a bit of correspondence that was going back and forth, and Gandhi was a young Gandhi, and Tolstoy was much older at the time. When he was seen as Tolstoy was a role model of Gandhi. So let's
Yep.
segue right into Mahatma, which means the great one,
Yep.
Gandhi. Lived in 1869 to 1948. A huge leader in the independence movement in India, which was a colony of Great Britain, and basically pioneered that independence through non-violent resistance, mass campaigns for peace, religious harmony, and social justice. When you think about India, there are many different religions in India, many different languages, many different
Yep.
cultures.
Yep.
Culturally diverse would be a kind of wouldn't cover the definition of India. It's very
Right.
extremely culturally diverse. Um, so Mahatma Gandhi did something that was incredible. He brought the British government to the conclusion that they could not hold
Right.
India as a colony. They could not just
Morally.
yeah, not morally and otherwise. I mean, they're still in there business wise, right?
Right.
But he actually did bring. There were all kinds of protests against corporations, British corporations in India that were allowed to the slowing down of commerce
Right.
and all of these
Boycotts.
goods flowing to India, to Great Britain.
Yep.
He hunger strikes as well. He used hunger strikes as well. And there were many marches for peace. One was the Dandi Salt March, and there were many marches that were part of the Quit India movement as well. So and incredible. And I mean, my little blurb about Gandhi is not doing him justice. We can do a deep dive and another
I,
time.
I,
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. I'd like to jump in real quick if you don't
Go
mind,
ahead. Yeah.
because I know you agree with this. The idea was to hold a mirror up to your oppressor
Yeah.
and change their mind.
Yeah.
And so when the police were, whacking the nonviolent protesters
Yeah.
and putting them in the hospital, it changed the heart of the British people and the viceroys,
Yeah.
and of course that was earth shaking.
Oh, that would have been absolutely earth-shaking, especially coming from a colonial mindset, right? And
Right,
predicated on the idea that these people in the colony are not as good as
right,
you,
right.
and where you're from, like an absolutely racist concept too. Yeah, no, an incredible figure in history as well too. So, what's the legacy of Gandhi? We're back into hearts and minds, but not in a military context, whatever. But he had a huge influence, of course, on Martin Luther King, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
he, and
Yeah.
he,
That's so. Yeah. So the world is familiar with Martin Luther King. He was part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and helped end racial segregation and also allow voting for all. And and really it's really important to remind ourselves that it was not natural, it was not normal to have racial segregation. In many ways, the South, from the end of the Civil War for 100 years, end of the Civil War until Martin Luther King, was under a Jim Crow system that was fascist. It
yeah,
was a racist, top-down government that tolerated no dissent, and and it really burns me when I see that people minimizing how bad it was,
it was
and
brutal.
and um, and so for there were threats to use violence to end segregation,
Yeah,
and perhaps the fact that that was out there in the background made a difference. We'll never know for sure. But the main thing is that Martin Luther King used Gandhi and Thoreau's and others' method of holding up the mirror so that people could see themselves and see their own anger and their own injustice, and to change their heart. And I know that most people are familiar with this story, but seeing it as part of a lengthy story, and to really recognize how big of a change it was. And I again, when I think of the future, when I think of the
yeah,
future of our kids, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I want to make sure that we don't go back to a Jim Crow
Right.
kind of society, and of course, so that's why you and I are doing
Yeah.
this.
Well, and violence begets violence, right?
Right,
I mean,
right, right, right.
that's a simple truth that I believe in. So if you think about what was going on during the Jim Crow era, I'll throw an example up, and you can expand at the
Yep.
Tulsa city
Hmm.
bombings,
Yep.
where literally people dropped bombs into neighborhoods where
From
people of
airplanes.
color and African Americans lived. Right,
Yeah.
there was no due process. It was a time where the color of your skin dictated the sorts of justice in quotations that would be. So it would have been very easy for folks to rise up and match violence with violence.
Right.
Martin Luther King chose not to. Why? I
Why?
mean, the
Yeah,
question is why.
indeed.
I
To
mean,
show up the
because
mirror, right?
right. Well, I mean,
Because if
yeah,
yeah, because you can't change the heart of someone that you punch, right?
you can't.
Yeah, and you know what? When we were talking about Iran or the Vietnam War or
Yeah,
Iraq, right, and winning over the hearts and minds of the people that you would like to help, right? If you're trying, if what whether it is uh, changing the hearts and minds of a police officer in segregated Alabama, or
yeah,
change or encouraging people who are against the Iranian regime
yeah,
to overthrow that regime. You can't punch them in the face
yeah.
and then have them act on your behalf, right?
Absolutely.
Or work with you, yeah. And and so yeah, so the the important thing is is changing the minds of the oppressors.
Absolutely. And we'll do a little jump in a little bit to Nelson Mandela. Nelson
Mhm.
Mandela jailed for most of his, as he said, his formative, his adult life, right, as
Yep.
a young adult, and was involved in some violent protests as a young adult prior to the jailing, and all the rest of that. But
Right.
he's in jail, and over time, and he's effectively running a protest movement from jail, on this little island off the coast of South Africa. But what happens when he's in jail? He reaches the hearts. He holds up the mirror. He reaches the hearts of his jailers,
Right. Yep.
and not in a false befriending. He
Right.
actually forms real relationships with
Yep.
them, and then he walks out of prison. They have the election, and apartheid comes to an end, and he becomes the president of South Africa. And of course, what do many folks around the world expect? Revenge.
Right.
They expected revenge. How could this person not seek revenge?
Right.
He was jailed. He
Right.
was
He was
abused.
jailed and probably tortured and all that.
He was abused while in prison.
Yep.
How could he,
Reach out to
right,
everyone.
right. And yet that didn't
Fascinating.
happen. It's an incredible example in history. We got some other examples to jump into.
Right. I was going to say, do you have any Canadian examples?
Well, I do. I do. I wanted to, yeah, I got some really good Canadian examples here, of just creative ways of nonviolent of protest. One is Nellie McClung. Nellie McClung she's a Canadian feminist, and she was an author and an activist. She was part of a group called the Famous Five in Canada, who basically
That
changed
sounds
the
like the Avengers or something
right. She
like
was
that.
well. She basically was like the Avengers. So we were ruled. Our Constitution was the British North America Act, and in the British North America Act, women were not considered to be persons.
Wow.
They did not have personhood, legal status as human beings
Right.
in the BNA Act. So she launches this case called the Persons Act, and it went all the way to Supreme Court, and ultimately she overturned that part of the BNA Act, and they had to declare women persons under Canadian law.
Just curious about when was that?
Oh, this is just after the turn of the century,
Yeah.
World War One type
Yep.
era. Incredible, right?
Yep.
So she also brought the vote to women in Manitoba. It was the first part of Manitoba. It was the first part of the country where women could vote. And one of her key protest tools was this thing called a mock parliament, where she held this parliament in a big theater in downtown Winnipeg, and all kinds of people came. The press came, and women formed this parliament where they debated the merits of allowing men to vote.
There you go.
And how by allowing men to vote, it would absolutely tear at the fabric of the family. It would tear at the fabric of society, and all these horrible things would happen if we let
Right.
men vote. How dangerous it would be. I
Yep.
mean, ironic that it can be quite dangerous if men
Right.
are making some kind of the
World
decisions.
War One.
Well, and many things. So
Yep.
she did that too. Another quick example is the Winnipeg General Strike up here in Winnipeg, a nonviolent protest where union after union, groups of worker after worker, this occurred in 1919, basically joined in a massive strike together, and including the police, Tim. The police went on strike with the protesters.
That's awesome.
And they ultimately, part of the army jumped in too, and it just they said, we're all being badly paid and we're all being
Right.
treated badly, and it was broken up violently, but it broke the hold of small number of families who effectively owned everything in Winnipeg. It kind of broke
Right.
that hold. So that was a huge one. Another great
Hearts and
example.
minds.
Hearts and minds. Another one is Viola Desmond, a businesswoman, an African Canadian businesswoman from Nova Scotia, Canada. She's on her $10 bill.
Yeah.
She refused to leave a whites only area at a theater. And so in Nova Scotia, so in the city where she was at, they basically said, well, you are a tax evader, and they held up this huge case against her. and the case was ultimately thrown out eventually, and then they tried again, and then they pinned her for this, I think it was like a 1 cent tax evasion case or something like that back in this is 1946, Tim.
Yep. Wow.
And eventually what happened was that it caused the Canadian Bar Review, Canadian lawyers got together and they realized that it would have been a lot easier for the courts in her defense to argue that the courts have no right to enforce racial segregation in Canada. And it was the beginning of the civil rights movement in Canada. So Viola Desmond, incredible. Now, I'm going to very quickly mention also one of the greatest snipers in World War I history, who was a First Nations man from Ontario, Francis Pegmabagau. He basically came back from World War I with every possible medal, every possible military decoration, and then was sent back to the reserve, where he couldn't leave the reserve, where he needed the permission from the Indian agent to do anything. Couldn't go to university, couldn't own land, couldn't run a business, on and on.
I'm gonna jump in translation, right?
Yeah.
The word used here is reservation.
Yeah.
So,
reservation. Yeah. So basically, he was a kind of there were many Indigenous veterans who came back and after World War I, and then they came back to basically some form of slavery or some form of,
that's so wrong.
A lack of complete lack of civil liberty, not being treated like they're a citizen, not being treated like a human being. But what did he do? What he did was he came back. He started basically a national Indian government movement in Canada, was what it was called at the time. And he effectively, one of the first things they did is they changed what's known in Canada as the part of the Indian Act, where chiefs, leaders of communities could actually speak to the government. And before then, it was only the Indian agent who was allowed to speak to the folks in Ottawa, to political leadership. So that was one of the first things. And of course, there have been many Indigenous movements. Indigenous people have risen up with allies. The ones that are very recent in Canadian history is something called Idle No More, the Land Back movement, pipeline protests, and the murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and plus would also go into the LGBTQ2S plus community. Those protests are ongoing in Canada and have made a massive change in our society. So that's a little bit of Canadian, and these protests are nonviolent. Where people have risen up.
That's the key, hearts and minds.
Absolutely. So Tim, we're going to go back to history now. Movements of the 1960s, 70s, civil rights, Vietnam. We're going to start us off here.
Right. So kind of you might remember at the beginning you talked about protests and movements, and we've been mostly talking about protests and occasionally talking about movements, and sometimes it's hard to tease the two apart. Basically, protests are a tactic, right, to advance a movement. And there was a time during the 60s and the first half of the 70s where there were a lot of movements here in American history and reflected also in Canada. And when you step back and look at them, right, the fight against the Vietnam War, the racial civil rights movement, the women's rights movement was kind of a second wave. The first wave was 1919, the right to vote, but really there wasn't protections in the workplace to be treated equally, and so there were a lot of laws that were passed because of that movement, gay rights, trans rights. So there's and others, and they can be frustrating, right?
Absolutely.
When you're in the middle of it, it seems like it's forever, and it might not happen. But over time, creating awareness and showing the justness by being peaceful and using arguments, you can change people's minds and make a big difference.
Well, and I think that is it Harvey Milk in San
Right.
Francisco
Yeah.
comes to mind for me. And I once stayed in a hostel, and they were doing a kind of, that's where I started learning about Harvey Milk, and I think he was the first openly gay politician
City
in
council member. Yeah.
city
In,
council member
yeah. In San Francisco. Yeah.
in San Francisco, right? Which was a kind of an earthquake going off in that community. It was actually, a lot of these things are a real test of our humanity, right? A real test of if we do believe in humanity of others, if we do believe in respecting others, if we do believe in diversity, then we need to be open. We need to be open. We need to be open to learn and and confront our own biases. So I think in the Harvey Milk era, there were a lot of people in San Francisco and sort of the state of California that had to confront their own biases, right? The things that they had been erroneously taught, whether it be through religious means, in school, in conversations in families, about what other human beings, right, and their rights. So it's a little aside on that part
I'm going to
too.
do an aside on the aside, right?
Do the aside
Um,
and the aside. Yeah.
so there has been a lot of success for gay rights over the last 20 years, and we remember, the bitter years, right, when there was a lot of prejudice.
Yeah.
But we cannot we can't let our guard down. For
No.
example, the Texas State Republican Party has in their platform that that the gay behavior is immoral,
Right.
and so it's so again, in order to be successful, to pass on to the next generation a moral, just government, we need to stay on our guard.
And Tim, I'm gonna need some help on this one a little bit too. But there's been the recent developments in changes to your driver's license, right? Changes to a gender identification. There's been laws in certain states, and I'm trying to think, I don't want to. It might have been Tennessee, could be Texas, but you'll have better information on this one.
I actually on this one, I'm not as up to date as
Okay,
I am on most issues.
right.
Um,
But
but
I
yeah,
do know,
there's
yeah.
backsliding.
Yeah, there's some backsliding on that. What I do know, like substantively about that, is that they have said, well, you can only identify as either, male or female on
Right,
your driver's license. So specifically, they're going after people that would not identify as either of those genders or trans, right?
right,
Specifically, and then they would have information about who is, the government would have information. So we're still in a very, very much so in a dangerous period,
right.
and that not to extinguish hope, but being mindful of these things and being aware of them, and having that, again, back to our right to protest, and back to this, the point about our conscience.
Right.
Let our conscience speak about these things. Allow us to look again, hold up the mirror, like you're saying, and see all of ourselves as human beings, and the human being in ourselves. So I think those are really important as well. I think we also wanted to talk about Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Um, I mean, a very good friend of mine up here, um, uh, comes from an indigenous background, and I think he once said to me when we were talking about, um, indigenous. We were talking about indigenous rights. He said, "Try being an indigenous person in Canada. Try it out for a week. Try it out for a month. See what that's like.
Right.
You know? See what that's like." And so, there's a long list of abuses, the longer than, and I want to be careful, but we think Rodney King, Trayvon Martin,
Right.
Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and Black Lives Matter, starting out. That movement is really another huge movement. Began as a protest, but ended up as a movement that led to legislative changes, and for people to take a hard look at your police force. What are police allowed to do? What are the rights of the citizen? How are police trained? I have people. There are people that I know in police forces across Canada who are working on those very issues that really were not being addressed in a substantial way
Right.
until you know tragically, horrifically, people have very publicly lost lives, right? Where people were publicly murdered by the state, right? For no zero reason, no good reason. And
Right.
then these things start to move. So we're back to this whole business of the protest becomes a movement, but then that movement starts to inform and educate, and information and education eventually turns to legislation. But it's not just rules and laws that are written out, is it? It has to do with that understanding that you believe in it, that it makes sense,
Right. Right.
that that
That's where the training comes in, and sometimes it's really hard to change the minds of law enforcement through trainings. So perhaps even like the idea of changing the culture, right?
yeah, changing the culture in the police force and the rest of it too.
Yep.
So let's go back to Minneapolis. So
Right.
one of the things you said to me about No Kings was that it really is uniting people,
Hmm.
but people that are coming from all kinds of different backgrounds, and
Ideologies.
people that are in ideologies, and people that
Yep.
are, yeah, people that believe in different things. So
Hmm.
Tim, what is uniting them? What would you say
Right.
is bringing them together?
You know, it's if you would have told me before George Floyd that Minneapolis would be the epicenter of two national things, I, I wouldn't have believed you.
Right.
And at first, I had a friend call me from Portland and say, "Oh my God, lightning striking the same place." But in some ways, there's similarities between George Floyd and Pretty Good, but there's so many differences too, right?
Yeah, of
There's a lot of differences.
course.
Um, but in both, if you are hearing that during George Floyd there was a lot of organizing to keep an eye out on neighborhoods to make sure that there was justice during during and after
Yeah.
the shooting. There was my sister was heavily involved in the George Floyd situation, and she says that they just reconnected with each other when the national government sent 3,000 secret agents um, to uh, to Minneapolis and to be unconstitutionally detaining people,
Mm,
oftentimes U.S. citizens. Um, one of the things that really jumped out was how there were minorities in off-duty police officers
yeah.
that were being pulled over
Yeah.
and detained. And so yeah, so what we're talking about is racial profiling by anonymous automaton federal agents.
Yeah.
And the in the past, federal forces have been called up by the president to, like in Little Rock, Arkansas,
Yeah.
to make sure that there's peace and justice.
Yeah.
And it's so sad to see this administration using the federal government for the opposite.
Right.
Um,
Against the
so
people. Yeah.
yeah, and so we with No Kings, there was at least for me, it was a sigh of relief. We made it through the winter, and there was at least a reprieve. But here's a quick anecdote.
Yeah.
I drove my sister and her daughter home after the No Kings event, and well, actually, we left a little early,
Yeah.
and so she said that what she's going to do when she gets home is to check and make sure that the network is still active during the No Kings protest to
Right.
make sure that there wasn't an increase of abductions, right?
Oh, right.
And so that is an anecdote that reminds us of how it's ongoing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an ongoing piece. So what sort of images, like when you think of you're in the protest, you're in the No Kings, what sort of like things you feel will stay with you? Tim? Like if you were to close your eyes and imagine it in your
Right.
mind's eye, what kind of stays with you?
Well, um, you might remember during the thick of it, I went to the Whipple building, which is
Yeah,
where the detentions were, and I interviewed some of the protesters and so on. And there was there was a movement, and I'm only going to get half the name right, but the word Haven was in there. It was
yeah,
started um, by just one person, a mother that really was struck that there were people being released from the Whipple building into 5 degree below zero weather, without a
yeah,
phone, without a jacket, without anything.
yeah, yeah,
And for me, I saw that, and
yeah,
there were and the people, the volunteers that were there with the orange vests and the walkie-talkies
yeah,
were right there, and they took him inside, gave him some hot soup,
yeah,
gave him a burner phone.
yeah,
Um, they talked about how sometimes they would drive him to a restaurant, and
yeah,
the workers there would
yeah,
give them some love, and so that's always going to be with me. Just seeing the people just walking in below weather
yeah,
with no jackets, and no federal agent right there, helping them out.
yeah. Just a
And
complete
yeah,
disregard for all of their needs, right?
the cruelty is the point.
Yeah. Do you think that, one of the things that I feel, just from afar with No Kings, is we look at the creativity.
Right. And I can say something positive about
Well, yeah, you look at the creativity of the protests too, but people have written also a lot about how cruelty is being normalized
right,
in the actions in the actions of the U.S. government. But at the same time, when you look at No Kings and the basically the peaceful protests and the creativity,
yep.
I feel like, at least from an emotional standpoint, that's a pushback
Oh,
on that. It's a huge pushback
right.
on that idea that somehow the American people are now more open to more, more accepting of, the state inflicting cruelty on I would say
More accepting of our
most
point of view.
vulnerable, on yeah, on the most vulnerable, right?
Right. And you know, I've studied a lot of military history as well, right?
Yeah,
And really, morale determines a lot of wars.
yeah,
Oftentimes, undergunned armies win because their soldiers care more about the cause that they're fighting for.
right,
And that's kind of been a theme of our talk today
yeah,
about how, whether it's putting up a mirror to an oppressor, right, and showing them how they're sinning, or that they are not acting in a just manner, right?
yeah, that's
Um,
right.
or putting up funny signs. The idea is to convince people of the morality gives us
Yeah,
the inspiration to continue, and it convinces the people of the justness of your cause.
yeah, it has courage too, right? the
Yeah,
cour- the courage to keep going when the forces that are doing these things,
right,
really would love to peddle the idea that the individual can't make a difference.
right,
And history has shown that it terrifies these regimes when people do get together. I mean,
right,
they always go after freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly,
right,
the right to protest. And they ban books and all these different things. They always go after things like this, like these regimes that are oppressing people, right? Because
right,
it's amazing. It's amazing for all of the guns and the people with guns and the power that they have. They do not When they do not have the consent of the people and they lack legitimacy, they're just hanging on, right?
right. right. And the people holding the guns
Right.
um, uh, want to set them down.
Of course they do. Absolutely. I think that's a great way for us to close off, Tim.
Yes.
Thanks for, I really, Tim, I really appreciate uh, what you had to say today about um, uh, George Floyd and
Right.
Black Lives Matter. A lot of people throughout the world would not, it's not reported that 3,000 agents went into the area, right, and
Right.
vetted themselves. I'd heard a little bit about that, but it's something that's lost. That people need to realize this is really important information. And also, the other thing it was absolutely inspirational to hear about the folks in Minneapolis, and I feel like it's a bell that's kind of ringing throughout the world. It really is. I mean, that might sound a little bit simplistic in my thing, but it is. It gives hope,
Right.
right? It
Right.
creates hope. So thank you for that. Really appreciate
And
it.
thank you to people like my sister who are on the front lines.
Absolutely. You're doing the heavy lifting.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Bye. See you, Chris.
Yeah. Bye bye.